It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast, presented, of course, as always, by DraftKings. Love the dudes over at DraftKings. Make sure you use code ROSS, whether you're on the DraftKings Sportsbook app or over on the DraftKings app doing any of the best ball stuff. I am so fired up for today's guest. We got mini camps going on like crazy. And I sent him this in an email, but it really is true. The guy's like a television draft analyst guru who works year round. I mean, he's already looking at the 2025 draft picks. He takes it that seriously, but he also really knows and likes the fantasy side of things as well, which makes him somewhat of a unicorn. Of course, I'm talking about Field Yates from ESPN. Check him out at Field Yates on social media. He joins me and the great Joe Dolan today. Check out Joe, as always, at FG_Dolan. You guys know the deal. There is no better content as it relates to fantasy football, pretty much everything out there, than fantasypoints.com. Just use that code 24FEAST so they know we sent you and so that you get that discount. Field, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. Really appreciate it.
Good to be on with you guys, and I've started my 2025 work. I've yet to get the Princeton tape, so I can't quite evaluate who the best Princeton prospect is, but I do promise you when the tape arrives, I'll be studying that as well. But really fired up, and I know we're talking fantasy today, but I'm fired up for some defense. Next year's draft class, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but for a year in which we saw the first 14 picks be offensive players, the other side of the equation, right? What do they say? Like, for every force, there's an opposite force coming to meet it as well. You're the Ivy League guy, so you know that Newton law a lot better than I do. But defense is back in 2025. I can promise you that.
I love it. Well, speaking of, you mentioned Princeton, so I got to ask Joe this real quick. Joe, what with all the T. Higgins stuff and all the no more Tyler, why isn't my boy Yosivas getting any love? Just because he's thought of as like an outside guy or a T. Higgins guy? It's like all I hear about is Jermaine Burton or Charlie Jones or all these other guys. I mean, Yosivas, what do you have, like 5 touchdowns and like 10 targets last year or something crazy?
I think you can make the argument, Ross, that Yosivas is actually a little underrated in Dynasty right now because of the uncertainty behind T. Higgins. So I'm certainly putting Jermaine Burton ahead of him. Our guy Brett Whitefield, who obviously we had on during the NFL draft pre-draft cycle, thought Burton was actually the best deep threat in the entire class. He had him ahead of Xavier Worthy in that regard. So that's why Yosivas is not getting hype. But I think you can make an argument that you could put out a little feeler for him. You could get him for a song in a dynasty league right now. So I wouldn't. So I'm not trying to gas you up here, Ross. I actually think. I'm not going out thinking. I'm not trying to tell you I think he's a wide receiver 3 this year. But I think you can maybe capitalize on some of that uncertainty.
I like it. I also like Fields' background. I mean, Fields. So we've talked about it before, I think, on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. But tell me if I have any of this wrong. Played football and lax at Wesleyan.
Yeah.
Then you got a gig with the Patriots as like a scouting assistant, scouting intern, and you did that for some time before you got in the media. And on the media side, you were primarily fantasy football for a while before you became just sort of a general analyst. And now it's almost like you're going back to your initial roots with the Patriots on the scouting staff by now doing the scouting stuff for ESPN during the NFL draft. Do I have that? Do I have the Field Yates timeline somewhat correct?
Yeah, that's pretty good right there. There was a cup of coffee with the Chiefs as well. Scott Pioli was the GM with the Chiefs who hired me. He, of course, had been with the Patriots, so we had some familiarity there. But yeah, I mean, to throw a baseball analogy here with Joe's terrific Philly fanatic hat right now, I'm from outside of Boston originally. So Pokey Reese, who played for a bunch of teams, but became kind of a cult figure in Boston, just this like did everything. I'm not sure he was ever a star at any of those things, but like you might see him like literally pitching on a day in which the Red Sox were either getting waxed or waxing the opposing team in the ninth inning. But super utility man. I think now it's kind of consolidated more towards two things, fantasy football and the draft, that I would argue are very sticky, right? I mean, people care about fantasy football, they care about the draft, and not a whole lot changes other than the players every year about those two events, right? Since 2010, the NFL draft has been a 3-day extravaganza, round 1 on Thursday, 2 and 3 Friday, 4 through 7 on Saturday. And until Roger Goodell or whoever's authority it is to change that decides to do so, we're going to look forward to a 3-day event with the best college prospects available, 7 rounds, 1 pick per team. That's how things are originally slotted. That's what I love about fantasy football as well, is you can customize the leagues however you want to do it. But generally speaking, fantasy football, I've played in leagues for 15 plus years, where the only thing that has changed is perhaps like our team avatar and our team nicknames.
That is awesome. And that's why I wanted to bring you on, Field, because in my mind, you know, we've been talking a lot about best ball the last few weeks. I probably should have mentioned this at the start, but we will be naming the entire best ball draft next week. So people need to get fired up about that. Maybe over the next 2 weeks, we'll let you know. So make sure you're submitting your entries with goodgranchers.com, code Ross, or rating and reviewing any of our shows. Even Money podcast for betting, college draft podcast with Emery Hunt, Fantasy Feast, and of course the flagship Ross Tucker Football Podcast. We, and by we I mean me and Joe, want to go against you guys in these DraftKings best ball drafts. You can also, by the way, just use the code Ross at DraftKings or DraftKings Sportsbook to enter as well. Any of those 3 ways you can get in these free best ball contests against me and Joe. But because you're doing the draft stuff, Field, but also because you've got such a fantasy mind, there can't be that many people in a better position than you to speak on some of these rookie fantasy prospects and guys you're most excited about. And I guess I want to start at quarterback and just what you think the upside is, the downside, and where these guys are with all these first round picks going off the board. Are there a couple that you're especially excited about from a fantasy perspective, Field?
Yeah, there are. And not to take the low-hanging fruit, I'll be curious where Joe nets out on this as well. But it's the first 2 quarterbacks taken in the real NFL draft as well. I just have the order reversed, as I would prefer Jaden Daniels to Caleb Williams for one very specific reason, which is that while Caleb's an awesome athlete, Jaden Daniels is a rare athlete. And if you just go back and look at quarterbacks historically, and if you can take a much smaller snapshot of the last 4 or 5 seasons, you know, there have been a ton of quarterbacks that have impacted the game with their legs. And there have been very, very few, like maybe Marcus Mariota a couple of years ago, that you would say that was clearly not a starting level fantasy football quarterback. If you can rush for 500 yards in a season as a quarterback, there's a pretty darn good chance that your floor is relatively high. But we're not chasing just the floor in fantasy football. We're, of course, chasing the ceiling as well. And while Caleb Williams might have the best wide receiver trio in the entire NFL, it's not like Jaden Daniels has a terrible situation around him with those wide receivers. Terry McLaurin, perpetually perhaps underrated, but maybe more importantly, just played with bad quarterbacks. He and Jahan Dotson, a very reasonable starting point for Jaden Daniels to be throwing the football to this year. I think Jaden Daniels is in a pretty good spot to be a top 12 quarterback right away. He was quarterback 12 for me in my initial rankings. Quarterback 13 is Caleb Williams. A lot of the same things apply. Great athlete, great situation, but Chicago by design may not have Caleb running the football all that much because I think they believe more in their offensive line than Washington does. And when you've got 3 incredible wide receivers plus 2 capable tight ends and a pass catching back in DeAndre Swift, Caleb Williams will be a point guard next year, much more so than Jaden Daniels, who might be like more Allen Iverson than a point guard. Like get your own buckets as well, as opposed to Steve Nash, which might be Caleb Williams in Chicago.
I like that analogy, Field. One question I had just as a follow-up. You know, I had a lot of people on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast before the draft, obviously talking about the quarterbacks. And what was consistent, Field, was two things. And I want to ask you about both these guys. One was praising Jaden Daniels. I mean, guys saying he was the best pocket passer of the group. Chase Daniel said he was the best progression reader. We all know and can see what you just said about him being a rare athlete. I guess my question as it relates to Jaden Daniels is, what does Caleb Williams do better? Why is Caleb Williams the choice for the Bears? Because several people came on the show and flat out said they liked Jaden Daniels more. And even others who didn't say that, when they talked about the two guys, it sounded like they liked Jaden Daniels more. I thought that part of it was really interesting. Certainly there was a lot more love for Jaden Daniels on my show than there was for Caleb Williams.
Yeah, I had Caleb number one throughout the process, and we're talking real football here, not fantasy for a moment. But Jaden Daniels finished as the second-rated prospect on my overall big board, and there were close to 400 guys that I had graded during this last cycle. So to be number two obviously speaks to how incredible of a prospect he is. I would say this is that I think Caleb's, to me, like a clear better passer overall than Jaden Daniels. That's not to say that Jaden's not a capable passer, but I do think Caleb far more consistent, better ball placement, better touch, better all levels accuracy than Jaden Daniels. Caleb got dinged for things that I think are fair. The sort of mentality of always looking for the home run as opposed to sometimes taking the easy way out and just moving the sticks. I think part of that was a reality check for the USC team as well. They were terrible on defense. Lincoln Riley fired a good friend of his defensive coordinator, like someone who's been with him for a long time. That's how bad it got. And then offensively, the players that were drafted by USC are from USC besides Caleb. He had two seventh-round wide receiver and Brendan Rice. Malik Washington, who I believe ended up going the seventh round. Taj Washington, Malik is from Virginia, but Taj Washington went the seventh round as well. It's not like there were a bunch of pass catchers around Caleb this year that were quite as dynamic as they were the year prior when he had Jordan Addison, a first round pick to throw to. So I feel like maybe some of the things that were negatives on Caleb Williams' report card from this past season were a bit more about circumstance than they were his natural ability. Not a consolation prize to get Jaden Daniels at number two, but I felt like Caleb was the superior pocket passer with better overall body armor as well that I think will hold up and stand the test of time in the NFL.
You know what stood the test of time for me over the years, Field? Labatt Blue Light. That was my drink of choice when I played for the Buffalo Bills 20 years later. It still is. Love drinking Labatt Blue Light with friends, teammates, living life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. I want to get to the other positions, I promise. But the other thing that happened that was really consistent, Field, with all of the people that I brought on my show, a lot of negativity on Drake May. I mean, a lot of negativity about inaccurate, raw footwork, misses the layups. So to me, as a guy that doesn't study these players, at least the quarterbacks, as much as you did, I thought it was interesting that the guy that went number two was sort of universally praised. The guy that went to number three was sort of universally criticized. I mean, across the board. I think Phil Simms used the word disappointed. So I guess I'm curious. Obviously, you're from up there. You live up there. Your thoughts on Drake May in general and from a fantasy perspective in particular.
If Drake May's college career had been reversed, we'd be talking about Drake May as a legitimate challenger to Caleb Williams as the number one pick in the draft. That's how special Drake was during the 2022 season. So as an evaluator, your responsibility is to go back and study all the relevant exposures and decide what is sustainable and what was more mirage than it was reality. And so with Drake, he has this 2022 season in which he wins all four of the major awards in the ACC, including the ACC Player of the Year. He sets the North Carolina single-season passing touchdown mark. He leads North Carolina in rushing yards as well. And keep in mind, by the way, in college football, they take away rushing yards for quarterbacks on sacks. Like That's not easy to do for a guy that's not running the football as much as somebody like Jaden Daniels was on designed runs this past season. He's 6'4", 230 pounds. I say often he was built at quarterback factory, right? This guy was born to play football, born to play quarterback at the NFL level. He has an absolute howitzer as well. I mean, the arm strength, he'll cut through wind. Like, he's got the elements factor that I think is important, Ross. You know that, right, from your career playing in both New England and Buffalo, right? Especially Buffalo. Like, you're going to have a few games each year where Mother Nature is going to be a big factor in that game. So I thought that Drake was more of a sort of a piece of clay than the other two quarterbacks. But I don't think it's that difficult at all to imagine the upside of Drake May that we saw in 2022 translating to being the best, or right there with Caleb Williams, as the best quarterbacks in the entire class. Is the quote-unquote bust potential a little bit higher for Drake? I would say so based off of how he performed this past season. But I didn't think it required this long telescope to go back and find clips or plays or sequences or games or moments to make me believe there's a chance that Drake May could be really special.
What about some of these other positions? And Joe, I don't know if you have a question about running back, because I'm sure that's the one that's kind of the most unknown. And we can get into the receivers, but Joe, do you want to have something on running backs?
Yeah, so my question to Fields would be, when you were talking to teams, how infatuated were teams exactly with Jonathan Brooks, and how high could he have gone if he was not injured coming into the draft process?
I got the sense, and I've said this as well, is that like if he had not been injured, he tore his ACL on November 11th, so do the math, 9 months gets you to August 11th. Maybe there's a chance he's ready for training camp. Maybe there's a chance he needs some time. I'll get into the data about what it has shown in terms of how players typically recover off of ACLs at that running back position. I think he had a chance to be a top 40 prospect. He ends up going a little bit later in the second round, not too much later, though, to Carolina. And what a potential spot for him based off of their backfield right now. But the player was such a factor, not just as a runner, but in the passing game as well. One of the hard parts about evaluating college running backs in the passing game is that because A, teams spread the football out so much, and B, defense is so bad in the NFL, quarterbacks don't have to rely on these running backs with checkdowns left and right. Sometimes what we see from running backs in the passing game lacks nuance. I thought that Jonathan Brooks was a little bit more advanced relative to most of the backs as pass catchers in this year's draft class. Kind of a weaving style as a runner, but very good speed as well. I saw some Aaron Jones when I watched him. I know that everybody has, you either love player comps or you hate them. I'm probably closer to in the middle somehow. But I thought the player was really, really, really good. My big concerns for him is the data that I was referencing, which is that there's always exceptions to the rule. But just go back and look at some guys at the running back spot the first year off an ACL tear. Breece Hall was like remarkable this past season, especially down the stretch, but the Jets had to build that up. And if you go back and look at his efficiency last year, he was a great big play threat, and you could probably blame the Jets' offensive line and the fact that they couldn't throw the football for this more than anything. But you know, his yards per carry average in a lot of games was fairly modest. I think Breece Hall will be an even better player than what he was last season this year. And by the way, Breece is like the optimistic best case scenario. You go back to Javonte Williams last year. We saw this with Dalvin Cook and Saquon Barkley as each of them came back from ACL tears earlier in their career. Those were seasons that, despite them being on the field, were lesser versions compared to where they were in other prime seasons of their career. And the Eagles certainly believe there are multiple prime seasons left for Saquon. So my expectations are a little more moderate on Jonathan Brooks, I think, relative to the fantasy community, just because of the ACL tear and the fact that Carolina's got a lot of bodies all of a sudden in the backfield.
What about, are there any other running backs, Field, that for this year in particular you really are excited about?
Yep, Trey Benson. Give me some Trey Benson, baby. Now an Arizona Cardinal, third-round pick, I believe 72nd or 73rd overall. I thought Benson was a potential top 50 player. Was awesome at Florida State. This guy is a broken tackle or a forced missed tackle waiting to happen. Touchdown machine as well for the Seminoles. Began his career out in Oregon, finishes up with the Noles. Factor in the passing game as well. I keep bringing that up, but obviously for fantasy football, guys who only tote the rock and are kind of dependent upon touchdowns and big runs those are a lot less consistent players week over week that we are ranking and eventually hoping score a lot of points. But Benson, 11 yards per catch this past season, only 20 catches. So it's not like it's a massive sample size, but still enough of a factor there that I have some optimism about how it will translate at the NFL level. And I know that we are infatuated by season-long fantasy. At the end of the day, you want as many guys like Tyreek Hill or Jamar Chase or Christian McCaffrey who can yield 18-week utility for you. But I always focus on guys that might have a pocket of games. James Conner has never played a full 17 or 16 game season. Never once. He's been around for a while now, too. There's going to be a time, if history tells us anything, that they need Trey Benson to step in. And I think this guy's going to prove behind what I think is like a quietly improving Arizona offensive line and overall that entire offense, that he's got a chance to become a starter in the NFL sooner rather than later. So I'm not using I'm using a top 6 round pick on Trey Benson. But once you kind of get past that point of the draft where you feel like there's a clear delineation between the player's value for the full season, and you're starting looking at like upside players, lottery tickets, you name it, I think Trey Benson is one of my favorite running back targets and one of my favorite running back insurance policies in the entire league.
Let's move on to receiver field. And obviously, there were a lot of them that went off the board. I thought it was interesting. Sean King recently came on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. He thinks that Brian Thomas for the Jags at LSU will end up being the best of the bunch. And he felt very strongly about it, having watched the tape. Is there a strong receiver take that you have, Field, either just evaluating the guys or as it relates to fantasy football?
Yeah, I think for fantasy purposes, I've got Marvin Harrison Jr. as wide receiver 10, which I think that is several spots ahead of ESPN consensus at least. I think most people will be ranking him or drafting him closer to wide receiver 15 or 18. You go back and watch Ohio State last season, which as I've dug in on the 2025 class, I have done. His teammate Emeka Abuga, a potential top 50 or so pick next year. He's got a pair of offensive linemen who could be drafted as well. Lots of Ohio State guys is the point. Travion Henderson, the running back as well. So I have gone back and watched Marvin Harrison Jr. And I think this is an interesting sort of concept when you're studying tape, is when you're not studying a particular guy and he keeps popping. And I'm saying that because I think there's a chance that Marvin maybe was underrated by the end of the pre-draft process. And I think he's just special enough that he is sort of almost quarterback agnostic, and yet he has a good one in Kyler Murray, that if you told me at the end of the season that Marvin Harrison Jr. is top 5 in the NFL in targets with 12 touchdowns, I'd buy it.
Joe?
Marvin Harrison Jr., I think, is somebody who, in some sharp drafts, is going to sneak into close to the first round because people are excited. We talked with Graham Barfield last week, Ross, on about best ball, and we were discussing how some of these second-round wide receivers, you have to almost hold your nose to pick them because they're the second and third round wide receivers are kind of in the same exact tier. I think Marvin Harrison Jr., there's enough of the unknown factor for him to get people excited about drafting him over a Devontae Adams or over a Deebo Samuel or over a Chris Olave, which may or may not be right, but given the level of prospect he is, and the fact that there's very little target competition there, I think people are going to talk themselves into that.
You know what's interesting too, Field? Looking at it how I do typically from a more macro level, if Harrison has a big rookie year, that's going to have a pretty big impact on the scouting process because you're going to see more guys that just don't do any of the combine pro day stuff and say, I'm gonna pull Marvin Harrison Jr. I'm just going to train for my next football season like I would normally train for my next football season. It could have ramifications, Field.
Yeah, he could be the disruptor, right? I mean, he showed up for the combine, weighed in, and that's it. But by the way, he didn't weigh in with the rest of the wide receivers. He showed up and weighed in before, I think, the offensive and defensive linemen. They went with sexiness before they did position in terms of how they assigned who was weighed in first. And he was the first player to have his measurements taken. He said, I'm going to the front of the line. So you're right. I mean, he was such a special prospect that he probably had a bit more cachet to pull that kind of card, or play that kind of card, I should say. But there's a chance that Marvin Harrison Jr. has kind of put a template together of, at the end of the day, we're football players. Train to be a football player. Don't train to be the fastest guy in spandex and a t-shirt.
Absolutely fantastic stuff, Field. Really appreciate the time. Make sure you check him out on social media. He is excellent. He's all over the place. Got a really cool combo now of doing the NFL draft stuff as well as the fantasy stuff for ESPN. Thank you so much, Field.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Joe and I will be back next week. Check him out at FG_Dolan. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We're at Ross Tucker Pod. I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.